Hey folks, Mr. Moffin coming back at you again. We're still taking a look here in AP Gov at topic 2.4, focusing in on roles and powers of the president. Previously, we've been looking basically at enumerated powers of the president, such as the ability to be commander-in-chief of the military, sign treaties, recognize nations, vetoing power, pardoning power, appointment power, all that kind of fun stuff. But today we're going to shift gears a little bit and get into something that is not, or some things that you're not going to find explicitly enumerated in the Constitution, but they exist nonetheless. And these are what we call informal powers of the president. We've talked a little bit about one of these examples in a previous video. We talked about executive agreements as a way for presidents to kind of bypass Senate treaty ratification. But that kind of falls in this category. And this is significant because, the growth of these informal powers of the president has certainly led to what some political scientists describe as the quote-unquote imperial presidency. That the president's powers have been growing, especially over the last 100 years, at a rate that seems to be going beyond some of the normal checks that the Constitution does kind of maintain. And, the general sense is that if power in government is a zero-sum game, if the president is taking on more powers, then it's coming at the expense of the other branches, most particularly Congress. So keep in mind that these are things you're not going to see in the Constitution, but they exist nonetheless, and they are very significant. One of these informal powers, and one that's been getting a lot of attention in the news lately, is focusing in on executive privilege. So what is executive privilege? Well, executive privilege is the right that presidents assert that they have the ability to keep private conversations that they have with their advisors confidential. The idea being is that presidents believe that having private conversations that are not made public are essential for a number of key things. For example, if an advisor for the president knows that anything they ever tell the president could become public record, well, that certainly might affect what they say in case something might not be very politically correct, or, it might be something that might be politically damaging to a president or that person. So it might, cloud the ability of advisors to be truly candid to provide the advice that a president may need. Also, presidents assert that executive privilege is necessary to serve as a check on any possible congressional intrusion on the ability of the president to do their job enforcing the laws. So they also cite that. And presidents also cite the necessity of executive privilege as a way to protect national security. Once again, the idea being is that, presidents serving as commander-in-chief are privy to a lot of important information that we would normally consider to be classified as in an attempt to maintain national security. Well, presidents have said that if they do not have executive privilege, then anything dealing with military operations, for example, could become public, and that could threaten our national security. So executive privilege has always been, or at least has been for a long time, been asserted by presidents as important and necessary. That being said, we don't ever really get a true test of the boundaries of executive privilege until the action surrounding this guy, Richard Nixon. For those of you that are not familiar, Richard Nixon was the center of one of the most infamous scandals in American history, the Watergate scandal. And the Watergate scandal basically involved allegations that folks working for his re-election campaign in 1972 were involved in all sorts of criminal activities, from breaking into offices, bugging phones, lots of things to try to thwart the Democrat candidate in 1972. And that even though Nixon may not have been privy to all, or maybe even most of these activities, he certainly was known he was told after the fact, and was involved in a cover-up, literally using his power as president to thwart an FBI investigation into the actions of his White House and his re-election campaign to try to, destroy his political enemies. Now, how does this tie into executive privilege? Well, long story short, the Senate is going to find out that Richard Nixon had recorded every conversation that he had in the Oval Office. And the Senate was very interested in wondering, did the president, as part of these conversations in the Oval Office, did he engage in conversations that would implicate him in criminal activity? Most importantly, did he engage in conversations in the Oval Office that show that he was attempting to abuse his power as president to cover up the actions centering on Watergate? So, if that's the case, then the Senate wants to know. And so the Senate will tell President Nixon to turn over these tapes that he had recordings done in the Oval Office. Nixon refuses to turn over the tapes, claiming executive privilege. Nixon claims that these tapes in their raw form includes conversations about a whole bunch of different things, including discussions of what's happening in the Vietnam War. So Nixon says that he cannot turn these tapes over. It violates concerns dealing with national security. He considers it an overreach, an intrusion of Congress in terms of his ability to do his job, etc., etc. In this picture, you actually see Nixon trying to negotiate or find a kind of a compromise measure. Since he refused to turn over the tapes, he ordered that the tapes would be transcribed, and anything that might be dealing with national security concerns would be edited out, and then, you can see what was left over. Unfortunately, the Senate is pretty much going to reject this, saying that they did not trust the White House to, not edit out stuff that would implicate them. So they ultimately were demanding the actual raw tapes, and still Nixon would refuse, claiming executive privilege. So what eventually happens is that the courts are involved, and the Supreme Court has to weigh in. At the end of the day, in the case of U.S. versus Nixon, yes, that's the actual name of the case, U.S. v. Nixon, the Supreme Court is going to rule that executive privilege does exist. And that was a question, whether or not executive privilege even exists at all. It does exist according to the court, but it is certainly not absolute. And it cannot be used in any way that might allow the president to block the legitimate actions of the other branches. In other words, prevent the other branches from carrying out their lawful duties. And as far as the court was concerned in the Nixon situation, Congress had a legitimate right to access these tapes. There were legitimate concerns. It wasn't just listening in on the tapes just to be nosy. It was out of legitimate concerns over possible criminal activity. So the court forces Nixon to hand over the tapes. And it's a matter of days after that before Nixon resigns, knowing that what is on the tapes implicates him criminally. Of course, we know at the end of the day, Ford pardons him. But note, executive privilege boundaries have certainly been tested in the case of Nixon during Watergate. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that this has been in the news recently because of some really interesting questions of other boundaries, potentially, of executive privilege. We know that on January 6th, there was an insurrection that took place centering in on trying to thwart the vice president's required duties to confirm the election results from 2020. As a result of that insurrection, we have seen the House of Representatives organize a select committee to try to investigate what happened in terms of why did this happen, who is responsible for organizing it, who should bear responsibility, etc., etc. Now, as part of this committee, we know that, remember, Congress has subpoena powers. They are holding hearings, and they can subpoena people to come down and testify under oath. However, some of these folks that have been subpoenaed by the House committee have been told to not comply with the subpoena, claiming that President Trump, now former President Trump, has invoked executive privilege, telling these folks that have been subpoenaed they are not to testify. Now, this leads to some very interesting questions. First off, can a president, or former president rather, invoke executive privilege? In other words, can somebody that used to be president now invoke executive privilege dealing with something that happened when he was president? We've never seen this tested before. We don't know. One of the people implicated is a guy named Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is also refusing to comply with the subpoena due to the direction of former President Trump, claiming executive privilege. So another one of the questions is, can you have somebody like Steve Bannon, who didn't even work for the White House on January 6th, could they claim legitimate executive privilege? So we do have some new questions about the boundaries of what this is. Ultimately, we're going to probably see the courts decide this for us. But in the meantime, we've actually seen the House of Representatives, vote to hold Steve Bannon in contempt of Congress, which is a criminal act. And we're waiting to see how the Department of Justice will respond to that. Anyhow, that's executive privilege. Now, another important informal power of the president is the president serving as a symbolic leader. The United States, of course, is a unique country in many ways. And one of those ways that we are unique is that we do not separate into two separate positions what we call the chief executive and the head of state. In countries like Britain, for example, they have a chief executive, and that is the prime minister, and that's currently Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is responsible for the enforcement of British law. But the head of state is Queen Elizabeth II, who is the symbolic leader of the country, the actual physical manifestation of, America and its leadership. Here in America, we don't divide those responsibilities. We make the President of the United States both the symbolic leader of the country and the chief executive at the same time. And it's this symbolic leader role that is not enumerated in the Constitution, but exists nonetheless and is still very important. We expect presidents, especially modern presidents, to be there for us when things are at their greatest despair, sense of despair. We expect the president to console us when tragedy happens. We expect the president to care about the nation when things are difficult. You may remember, Franklin Roosevelt, doing fireside chats to, kind of help the nation through the Depression. But in more recent decades, for example, you have following the 9/11 attacks, you see a picture here of President George H.W. Bush at the 9/11 site, working with first responders, firefighters, police officers, etc., rallying the nation together and using this bullhorn here to basically say that we are going to retaliate and we're going to, make those that attacked us in 9/11 pay. That's a rallying thing. People don't rally around the president in this case because he happens to be the one that enforces the law. They rally around the president in this case because the president's the symbolic leader of the country. Years before that, we had the tragic Challenger explosion, the space shuttle that exploded in 1987. When that happened, this was an unbelievable body blow to the nation. We had prided ourselves on space being something that was a joyous thing that brought the country together in a positive way. But when this tragedy happened, the nation looked for leadership. The nation looked for somebody to kind of give us a collective hug and tell us that it's going to be okay. And in this case, this was Ronald Reagan. You can see Ronald Reagan here with First Lady Nancy Reagan attending services for those astronauts that died in the Challenger tragedy. We look not to the chief executive for that. We look to the symbolic leader. We look to the head of state for that. But note, it's not just about presidents being there when times are tough. We also look for the president to be that head of state that kind of gives us that seal of approval, that thumbs up, representing the country's thumbs up about something. And here's an example of that. This is President Obama about 6 years ago meeting with the then Super Bowl champs, New England Patriots. This is a traditional thing. The president meets with the Super Bowl champs, World Series champs, NBA champs, college football champs, et cetera, et cetera. And it's, once again, why is it an honor to meet the president for this? Not because he enforces the laws, but because he's the head of state. All right? Well, we're going to leave it right there for now. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.